the PDC with the exception of Louisa. There are some unique trends about Louisa. I'm happy to expand on those as we go through, and I'll maybe reference a couple of them, but I do think there's a lot of alignment between what we see happening in Charlottesville, the metro area, and Louisa as a whole. When I'm looking at the breakdown of the presentation, the first part I'm going to talk somewhat about general population trends I see in the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission. The second part, I'm going to go a little bit more into talking about how I see housing and demographics connecting. I'm going to try to really add a little bit of context, looking at other parts of Virginia. How do those areas compare with the Charlottesville area when we're talking about population or housing affordability? And I'm also going to look at college towns around the country. I think that's a great way of trying to compare Charlottesville and see how unique the metro area might be compared to some of these other college metro areas. At the end, the last few minutes, I'm going to touch on just a couple big macro trends that I think are going to continue to be a pretty big factor in influencing where people move and what people are willing to pay for housing in the TJPDC, but I think also in areas outside of it. When I put that presentation together to talk to the Charlottesville Chamber of Commerce, State of the Community, one big point I made then, and I think it's really worth repeating, is that I spend most of my time not out giving presentations like this, but going through demographic data, producing data sets for the state, estimates, projections, and I look at a lot of different localities. And when you look at data for the Charlottesville MSA, it is really extraordinary. And I'll go through a couple examples. And that's something I think really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about housing in the area, is just how extraordinary it is and how it's attractive, and in the certain groups it's attracted and maybe not been able to attract. But I think there's also another point I didn't necessarily make then, but it seems pretty obvious when you look at housing data for the region, is that while the region may be extraordinary, its problem with housing is not extraordinary. It's one that most communities around the country also have, but I think it's important to keep in mind most of them have so far handled it better than the Charlottesville region. So focusing on the extraordinary element, if you look at a lot of different economic indicators, Charlottesville stands out. This one just shows the average family income, and Charlottesville is one of the few small metro micro areas around the country that have such a high level of family incomes. This isn't just driven by a couple billionaires pushing up the average. When you look at the top 20, 25% of income for families in the region, there really isn't anything that compares with it until you get into very large metro areas. The only other small areas that really compare with Charlottesville when you look at income levels are these areas too small to be metro areas called micro areas, places like Park City, Vail, Key West, places that have attracted high net worth individuals for a long time. That is in many ways what Charlottesville looks more like than the typical college town. We think about this maybe being Charlottesville and Albemarle, but this is also true when you look at the rest of the TJPDC. Back when Charlottesville and Albemarle were more isolated, they were still wealthy, say back in the 60s and 50s. When you built 64, 29 was widened, you saw some of the largest drops in poverty in the country from 1970 to today in places like Fluvanna, Louisa, Nelson, when they got connected to the economy of Charlottesville. So there's that influence of Charlottesville's wealth has really influenced the TJPDC as a whole. Another measurement, when you look at educational attainment, college towns tend to have high levels of educational attainment. Charlottesville's among the highest in the country. There are really only just a couple other metro areas that have such a high share of adults over 25 with a college degree. Some of this, I think, goes back to UVA and the fact that UVA there really isn't a comparison where you have a university, a research university of its size, or the hospital of its size in such a small metro area. The closest might be Dartmouth, but it really doesn't have the same level of research or medical center. So it does have that sort of outsized influence. One of the few metro areas that has a larger share of its population with college degree is Corvallis, Oregon. And I think there's some interesting parallels I'll touch on briefly later with Charlottesville. One other statistic I think really worth highlighting is this last one, that close to a third of households in the Charlottesville metro area report investments as a primary source or a major source of income. Households that are basically independently wealthy. You really only see that in Florida, that level share, and then again in Charlottesville. So again, it looks in some ways not like a college town. The metro area looks more like some of these areas people go to retire, places people go when they don't have to go into the office and work. So it looks really extraordinary there. Most areas that are this extraordinary have really high levels of income, really high levels of educational attainment, a really skilled workforce, are growing at very rapid rates. Raleigh, Austin have doubled in population over the last 2 decades. But when you look at the Charlottesville region, in the orange on this chart, it's grown. It's grown a little bit faster than other metro areas in Virginia, but it's really been pretty middling when you look at growth. Um, and if you look more recently, you see growth accelerating in some more affordable parts of Virginia, like the Shenandoah Valley. I think some of this goes back to the fact that Charlottesville has been an extraordinary place for a long time. I think planners have tried to keep it that way. I think there's been a large focus on that, but the cost of that has been that it has prevented more people from coming here, likely causing also more people to leave who haven't been able to find a place to live. But there's one important point I think to keep in mind when you look at population numbers for the Charlottesville region is that even if maybe some growth is suppressed, it still has steady growth. Over the last 2 decades, the metro areas added about the equivalent of the city of Charlottesville's population. When you look at our forward projections going out over the next couple of decades, the region should be expecting to add the equivalent of the city of Charlottesville's population again. And it's going to have to basically build the city of Charlottesville somewhere within the TJPDC, multiple locations, but it's going to have to happen, or you're going to see a good deal more pressure on the local housing supply. When you zoom out a bit, and I noted we've seen growth accelerating in the Shenandoah Valley, we've seen accelerating in the Richmond metro area. There has been a significant national trend the last 5-10 years where growth has become much more spread out. If you like maps, you can enjoy these, but if you don't, just look at the difference left before the pandemic and right after the pandemic and the number of counties that are green. The number of counties in green, those are the ones that are attracting more people than they're losing. We're seeing much more widespread growth through migration now than we saw a few years ago. It's not something we're necessarily seeing as much in most of the Charlottesville metro area. The big exception has been Louisa County, which has been among the fastest growing counties of Virginia the last few years. We have seen some growth spread out from Albemarle and Charlottesville to the outside areas, but not really on the level you see in much of the other parts of Virginia. If you look at areas like the Northern Neck, I was recently down in Southwest Virginia. They've seen a remarkable turnaround in migration trends where the Bristol metro areas had the highest migration rate the last few years of any metro area in Virginia. So it's been a really remarkable shift. A couple different factors driving. I think one has been the tight labor market you've had nationally. So there's just more job opportunities outside of higher cost metro areas like DC. You're having more businesses being created in these small towns. Housing prices in general going up in 2020, I think, has just encouraged us more. And then the other factor really that developed in 2020 was the explosion of remote work, which is just adding far more geographic flexibility in where people can live. Kind of a debate I've often heard is where does Northern Virginia start? People have often said sometimes Culpeper, Warrenton, the Beltway, but since 2020, I'd argue it's pretty much any part of Virginia north of the James is essentially Northern Virginia today. It's that economically tied. We're seeing hundreds and thousands of people coming out of Northern Virginia, keeping their jobs in Northern Virginia, and taking their salaries, moving to places like Charlottesville, the Valley, or the Richmond metro area. This chart here shows us the change the first 3 years of the 2020s we have data for in the younger half of the workforce, 25 to 44. Younger adults compared to the last decade. You can see the sort of reversal I mentioned where Albemarle Charlottesville had some of the fastest growth in Virginia and younger adult population in the 2010s. That's essentially reversed where that population is shrinking at this point. When you look at places like Fluvanna, Louisa, we see the opposite. That was shrinking, now it's growing. And other areas with a relatively low cost of living have seen the same trend of more young adults coming in. Charlottesville and Albemarle look a little bit more like Northern Virginia when you look at this data where the younger adult population is shrinking. The only population growing in Albemarle and Charlottesville right now is the retiree age population. Back, I guess it was about last year, I spoke to Albemarle County's long-range planning committee for the schools, and one point that was really noticeable when you looked at the enrollment data is that they still hadn't recovered from the pandemic. Enrollment was growing, but at a much more reduced rate from the pandemic. There wasn't that sort of bounce back. If you go out to Louisa County, they've had some of the fastest growing public school enrollment in Virginia coming out of the pandemic, again, with families moving out to some of these areas that are a bit more affordable. Some of this is from the pandemic. I think some of this is a bit longer term trend as well. This chart shows us where workers in Albemarle and Charlottesville live, how that's changed since 2010. And you can see that some of the strongest growth we've seen in workers coming in to the urban center of the PDC have been coming from outside the PDC altogether. Over the last 2 decades, the number of workers coming over from Augusta County has doubled, from Rockingham it's quadrupled. We're at a point right now where we have about as many workers coming into Charlottesville and Albemarle who live in the Valley than live in Charlottesville and work in Charlottesville and Albemarle County. Back in 2019, I was doing some work with UVA, part of their initial exploration of whether they should get involved with employee housing as part of their strategic plan. I remember seeing a number of you all in some of those initial meetings, and my role really was going through some of their employment data. One statistic I remember that really stood out was that back in 2019, I think it was a little over a third of their workers earning less than $42,000 lived over 25 miles as a crow flies from UVA. So past Fishersville, past Livingston, past Palmyra. Many of these are making that long distance commute then, I think because they couldn't find housing they could afford closer to UVA. I would imagine that percentage has only gone up since 2019. So in this next section, I'm going to really focus a bit more just on this housing part and thinking about demographics. When we were doing this work as part of UVA's initial exploration of whether they should focus more on housing, I remember another statistic that really jumped out was this one, which was how expensive Charlottesville was compared to most other metro areas around the US. It's wealthy, but it's also quite expensive. And when you try to look at the difference between the cost of housing and incomes, Charlottesville still comes out even more expensive. Charlottesville and Albemarle were more expensive than Northern Virginia when you did that level of analysis. I think since the pandemic, we've seen this worsen in part because you've seen housing prices go up in Northern Virginia. You have a lot of retirees who've built up equity where Charlottesville is still relatively affordable to them. You also have this dynamic you didn't have as much just a few years ago, where you have plenty of people earning relatively high salaries in Northern Virginia, maybe $250,000 a year. But even at that salary level, Northern Virginia is still quite difficult if you want a certain quality of life. Bring $250,000 to Charlottesville, you're not living like a king, but you're certainly living a lot better than you would in Northern Virginia. And that's, I think, put more pressure on the housing supply as well. So when you're thinking about housing prices in the metro area, it may cap growth, but it doesn't limit it. It basically just is determining who is able to live in the region and who isn't able to. As I noted earlier, the group that increasingly isn't able to live in the core of the region, at least, are younger adults. This chart here is just looking at if a hypothetical 25 to 44-year-old looking at their income levels was able to buy the median home value, basically the assessed value by metro area. We're making some optimistic assumptions that interest rates go down to 6% and they've got a 20% down payment. Charlottesville still, only about 2 in 5 of these younger adult households could buy the median home. And many of these would be older, used homes, likely further out. That's the lowest share you find in Virginia metro areas as a whole. Many younger adults, and many adults in general, don't want to buy an older home that might need a lot of repairs. If you think about a day like today, having your 15-year-old AC go out is going to be unpleasant in a lot of ways, but it's also going to create a good deal of financial stress. If you're trying to buy a new detached home in Charlottesville, Albemarle, it's gotten a little better than it was earlier this year, but it's still the cheapest new detached home you can find on the MLS is $650,000 out in Crozet. Less than a quarter of households aged 25 to 44 in the metro area could afford that. And if you think about the fact that many young adults simply don't move to the area as a whole, this is a select population we're dealing with already. And this isn't just learner households. These are most younger adult households. One example I was thinking about recently, my wife works in the hospital and she had a number of friends who are medical residents. They've come out of med school. I think looking at the numbers just now, UVA pays first-year residents at UVA $64,000 a year. Not too long ago, a resident came to Charlottesville. They could buy a detached home, start a family while in residency. Many of them would stay and work in the hospital system. At this point, that's really not possible in that salary and still be within 15 minutes of the hospital, have a detached home. And that is, I think, undoubtedly causing UVA to be able to attract fewer medical residents coming in and probably losing more of them when they become doctors or attendings. You see that just in the medical center. I think you probably see that throughout UVA, and you probably see that for a lot of employers around the region, how hard it is to compete for workers when housing is so expensive compared to other metro areas within Virginia or around the country. This chart here is looking really at college metro areas. There are 33 in the US that have over 30% of their workforce employed in education or medicine. And this is looking at the ratio of the median home value to the median family income as of 2023. One thing you can notice is just how high Charlottesville ranks on that, where it has some of the least affordable housing for any college town around the country, the Corvallis really being the only exception. When you look at the most expensive metro areas, I think one thing that really stands out is most of these, Chapel Hill, Athens, Corvallis, are suburbs of larger metro areas they're adjacent to. And I think this is true for Charlottesville too, when you think about Northern Virginia. They've basically become attractive, but also somewhat exclusive suburbs of these big metro areas nearby. The proximity in many cases caused them to have stricter planning to try to not become absorbed into these larger metro areas, but it's also pushed up the cost of housing. Smart Growth America has a ranking system where they rank cities on their ability to control sprawl, and Corvallis ranks very highly. Charlottesville's, I think, up in the top 20%. Most of these are, but there is this side effect here as well. What is interesting, though, is when you look at most other college metro areas around the US, they don't actually tend to be that as similar to Charlottesville or these high worth ones. If they're more remote, they often tend to be more affordable than the rest of the US. When you look at how the ratio of home value to income, they tend to be growing more, and they also tend to build more than the rest of the US. And in many cases, they do this while also having less sprawl. There's a number of ones here you could go through that are on Smart Growth America's ranking system that have better sprawl rankings than Charlottesville does. But one I'll focus on, I've highlighted here, is Iowa City. I spent better part of a year out there in 2023, and it's an interesting place to compare. And we have a little time. I'm just going to spend a minute or two looking at it. Iowa City is essentially one county, about the same size as Albemarle and Charlottesville area. It used to be smaller in population than Albemarle and Charlottesville 2 decades ago. Now it's larger because it's grown more quickly. One element you can see in this chart on the left is that why it's grown faster is they build more. There's a little bit of a chicken and the egg there, but it's also far more affordable. Home prices there have only risen about a third as much as in Albemarle and Charlottesville, despite growing much more rapidly. The map on the right, it may not be that obvious depending on how your screen size is, but it's done this in a fairly compact manner, relatively little sprawl. Some of that, I think, goes back to the point that you do have Iowa City, but you have a number of towns around it. Hills in the south, there's West Branch in the east, which is where Herbert Hoover is from. All these areas are sort of competing with each other, each of these towns, and they build a certain amount of housing. They're trying to build a community they like. It's not as necessarily controlled from the top, but you still have fairly compact growth. And this is just a little bit of a picture of 2 areas in Iowa City I spent a lot of time on looking at Google Street View. The one on the left is where a lot of the growth in the city is happening. It's moving out into the countryside, but you can see there are pretty clear lines between where the farmland stops and the city starts. They're building a variety of housing. There's apartments there on the left, townhomes, somewhat McMansions, and they really do this intentionally. They try to follow the grid pattern, they extend the grid pattern, they add bike lanes, they add sidewalks. It's a fairly intentional process when they're doing this, but they're doing it without any sort of strong urban-rural growth boundary. It's managed to be a lot more compact still. So one of the things you see is on the right here is that the vast majority of the countryside there remains in farmland. It's highly productive. On the right, there's a creamery in that right picture that processes a lot of the local dairy farms. It's staffed by a number of refugees who have been resettled there. They have a similar refugee resettlement program because they also have a large Mennonite population. But unlike the Charlottesville area, most of these refugees have been able to afford to stay there. Their immigrant population has grown about twice the rate of Charlottesville and Albemarle, and it's larger today, I think in part because the area is more affordable and more of these refugee families and immigrant families are able to stay in the region than in ours. There are some factors I think that Iowa City has that help it out. I think one is that they do have this grid historically and they've stuck to it. We don't have that when you look at the Charlottesville region. This point about towns, I think, has also helped them. You see the same thing if you look up at Loudoun County and parts of Northern Virginia. Often when you have towns that aren't necessarily so concerned about schools and some of the other financial elements, they can focus more on housing. And so you do see more housing production, but at the same time, they're often focused on quality of life. So there are some advantages that they have there, but I would say their biggest advantage is their lack of amenities. They're 4 hours from anywhere. They have a pretty rough climate, I can tell you from my personal experience. There's no mountains, there's no water. So they've had to really work on becoming an attractive place, on having a high quality of life. And one of the areas that really has come out is in producing housing that's affordable. So getting towards the end here and focusing on just some of these larger factors, I think that we'll see affecting housing here in the Charlottesville area, but I think nationally as well. One just, I think, basic but important point to keep in mind, this chart here shows is what type of housing do Americans live in by age? When you look at this, one thing that you really notice is that aside from around the time when people maybe leave their parents, go to college, and before they form a family, that's one area where you do see a lot of people living in high density apartments or condos. Outside of that, when you get out of that, you find about 80% to 90% of Americans are living in detached homes. And that's a pattern you see really kind of consistently over time, and you see consistently around the country. It really, I think, starts somewhat with families. When you look at families, they're about 8 to 9 times more likely to have, if they have children, live in a single family home that's detached than an apartment. Even if you look at townhomes versus single family homes, they're about twice as likely to live in a single family detached than attached. And after that, you don't tend to find many moving back to apartments or condos. If you look at 80-year-olds in the US, 80% of them live in single family homes. There's not a huge movement towards downsizing as much as you might think. And so this really channels, I think, the demand and where people want to live and somewhat where we see growth. Brad Wilcox is a professor at UVA, and he recently did a fairly significant national study looking at adults under age 55, their preferences and where they wanted to live in. Two things he had that really stood out were one, that there were about 3 times more people nationally living in apartments than said they wanted to, and far fewer living in detached homes than they said they wanted to. None of this is to say that our region should be building fewer apartments. I think developers are savvy, they know what they're doing. Likely, they probably should be building more. But when you look at single family construction, you look at the prices in the area, they're high and production levels are still much, much lower than they were before the financial crisis. They've never really recovered in the region. There are other parts of the country where single family home construction has recovered. I think the rich metro area is one of them. And home prices there are far lower because that demand is being met. There's a certain amount of nuance there. I think one example I'll share with you on if you build apartments, sometimes it can free up single family homes. About a decade ago, I did work with the city of Charlottesville. Their public school enrollment was growing, but they weren't building any single family homes. The only thing, if you recall, Charlottesville had built were those major apartments on West Main Street. They didn't have public school students in those apartments. But what we found when we went through their student address data over time was that students in public schools had basically moved into these neighborhoods where there's single family homes close to UVA. Building the apartments along West Main Street seemed to have pulled public schools or pulled UVA students out of these single family homes and allowed families to move in. That maybe will continue if you see the new apartment construction, but I recall UVA back in late 2023, along with the city, try to map out where their students were. And one thing that was obvious is that there are relatively few UVA students now living in single family homes. If you build more apartments, I think it'll be great for people who live in them, particularly younger professionals. But if there isn't production in the PDC or near the job centers in the PDC of single family homes, you're likely going to continue to see the loss of young families from those areas. I think that's one big trend to keep in mind, just thinking about where that demand is and how that influences housing prices. Another one I think is important to keep in mind, it's a fairly big macro factor, is people often talk about middle class shrinking, but don't really explain why it is. And the reason it has been shrinking is we're getting wealthier. The growth we're seeing in income in the US, shown in this chart, really has been shifting over into those higher income households. earning over $200,000, earning over $125,000. It's a positive trend in many ways, and we've seen that to a greater extent than Virginia or the U.S. as a whole. The share of households in Albemarle earning twice what the median income is has risen, I think, from 11 to 19% over the last couple of decades. But one thing it means is that when you have a small share of the population that has most of the spending ability, it really dictates trends in ways you maybe haven't seen before. If you have something that's in limited supply, like housing in certain parts of the PDC, they have the ability to pay far more than anybody else do, and will be willing to do that if that's where they're going to live. It's the same dynamic we've seen in the last couple of decades. If you look at Super Bowl tickets or Disney World tickets, they've gone up by a huge amount because it's a one-off expense and it's one of high value, and these households have the ability to pay that. I think that's going to continue to be a factor in the region if housing isn't in place that these people can buy. You're going to continue to see cases I've seen in Charlottesville of Sears homes going for $1.5 to $2 million because people want to live in some of these neighborhoods. And then there's this one last point, I'll leave you with, kind of zooming out a bit and looking at our region in connection to the East Coast. You have this factor that's been going on for a while where we have about as many people turning 18 to 65. So the labor market has been quite tight. We've seen remote work sticking around. Those two factors mean that people have a lot more options in where they choose to work. If they're working in person, there's more jobs they can pick in different places. And if they're working remotely, they have a lot more of this geographic flexibility. Places like Charlottesville may be relatively expensive, but if you're coming out of the Northeast, it's not necessarily. I think you're going to continue to see a large amount of people coming into the region from these higher cost areas because the area is so extraordinary, it is so attractive, but it is going to likely be offset by people leaving. It's going to put a good deal, I think, of pressure on the housing supply in the region and local planning just because the area is so extraordinary. But in closing, I think this goes back to this point I made at the start that the area may be extraordinary, but this problem of housing isn't one at all. I don't think it's nearly as complicated maybe as people always make it out to be in some cases. Interest rates are out of the area's control. Building prices are out of the area control, but some things are. One case I'll share with you, and it's not as an insult to the Planning District Commission area or Mississippi, but Mississippi used to always be ranked last in educational rankings year after year after year. And about 20 years ago, they decided it shouldn't be that hard not to be last. So they looked at what other states were doing right and wrong. They made significant, but I think critically sustained efforts in constantly improving, reassessing what they're doing right and wrong. And you may have seen this in the news recently. Mississippi's test scores last year surpassed the country as a whole. They're higher than California's, they're higher than New York. They're quite close to Virginia's at this point. When it comes to housing, I think the region should try to think of itself a little bit as a Mississippi. I think it needs to be doing a lot more result-oriented assessments of whether its local governments are allowing and permitting enough housing to be built in the areas people want to live in, and the type of housing people want. That's all I have for you now. I appreciate your patience. I think we should have some time for any questions or comments, but my email's in the slides. I shared them with Logan. You're always welcome to get in contact with me if you have any questions.
Hamilton, thank you so much for the presentation. Folks, I'll open this up for questions, comments, and I would ask that you, I'll do my best to see raised hands in the chat if I can get everybody in my screen.
Sure how to raise the hand. There we go.
If somebody else sees a raised hand, go ahead and call on them.
Got Jesse with his hand up.
All right. First and foremost, thank you for that very insightful discussion. I don't think there's much. I mean, there's a lot that you said that is nice and concrete data, which I appreciate. A lot of us I'm a home builder by trade, so I have a lot of this anecdotally. So it's nice to see it on paper. I think the one thing that I would be curious in, and this is kind of some board of supervisors from Southside, Southwest Virginia, because we're talking about largely migrations of people, not so much like an organic growth. Like we're not seeing fertility rates, right? Like we're talking the next to me, I can't talk about housing without talking about the next 50 years, because when we build a house, it's got a 50-year life expectancy, barring whatever maintenance comes to that. My curiosity is as you have two major demographics, come to an end, or generations, boomers, and as you see Gen X kind of coming into the fold, what does that compounded birth rate look like? Are we talking about a potential with other migration absent, if it's immigrants that kind of are the ones who have to fill the void, 50, 60 years from now, what is the housing situation just from that organic perspective look like? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
You have great assets. The Weldon Cooper Center is right beside you, so I'm sure you can get some of that.
No, and that's my colleague's job is projecting that out, and I help with that. We were just talking about this yesterday. We have projections coming out in the next month, going out, I think, to 2060. So not 50, 60 years, but close to that. I think over the next 20, 30 years, when you look at the cohorts, the demand for housing from young adults forming households is going to be stronger than we've seen the last couple of decades. After that, that's where the question starts to come up, is what then? Because as you noted, birth rates have been down quite a bit, and they've been dropping quite a bit recently. My hunch is that you're going to see that void on a national level filled somewhat just through immigration. People talk about automation that never really seems to fill the demand for workers. So I think that maybe you'll have slower growth, but you'll still have some, not decline. The number of households, though, is probably going to grow a lot more than the population. If you think about aging, you kind of go from this dynamic where you see this a lot in Southwest Virginia. The typical family used to be 2 parents, 2 children. Now the typical household is 1 person who lives alone. And so even though you have a shrinking population, the demand for housing is actually stronger than it's ever been. I think you're going to see a lot of that going forward. One last point, just thinking about the PDC, as I noted, it's historically been very attractive. Its geography is not going to change. I think you're going to have that sustained pressure for a long time on the area that's going to be there. When you start getting outside of the area, it is harder to know what will happen when you think long term, 50, 60 years out. I think there's a lot of question marks whether, is Northern Virginia going to be shrinking, or is it going to be Southside shrinking? To me, it's not obvious which one that's going to be. But thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Emily, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry that I showed up a little late, but I came in when you were talking about telecommuters, people who are living outside of the area where their jobs are. And I'm really interested in that because I think we're not very aware as a community of how much they're influencing our housing prices. And I wondered if you see that trend changing as federal workers are called back to being in the offices, and also as federal workers lose their jobs.
No, thank you. The federal workers one is interesting. There's been a pattern in the last couple of years of employer after employer saying they want workers back in the office, and that make these big public announcements. I kind of got to the point where I think that's just, as you mentioned, a way of cutting jobs. If somebody quits, you don't have to pay benefits. Because when you look at the best data on remote work, the number of people working remotely has been going up, not down. The share of work done remotely has basically been stable since late 2021. And you think about how different things were in late 2021. I remember flying over to Europe late 2021, and I was pretty much the only person on the plane. But the amount of work being done remotely really hasn't changed since then. So there's a lot of talk, but when you look at the numbers, it's been remarkably persistent. The share has been persistent. The number is going up. Getting numbers on kind of a local level is tricky because there's often a lag with this kind of data. It's somewhat micro. There's one data set, and I use it a little bit for commuting from the Census Bureau, and it's only available just through 2022. I think there's other data showing this is continuing. We just don't have hard numbers. But one statistic that really jumped out to me was that if you look at the portions of Virginia outside of Northern Virginia, from 2019 to 2022, there were 25,000 additional DC area workers who were now living in this part of Virginia outside Northern Virginia, but still working in Northern Virginia. And this is only private sector. Federal workers aren't even counted in that. That's equivalent of the Pentagon or the Amazon second headquarters being relocated somewhere in the rest of Virginia. So it is having a big impact. And I think I think in the Charlottesville area, its impact, when you look at some numbers, maybe is understated just because I think there's been a lot of churn. I think as housing prices have gone up, you've had a lot of people exiting the area, going to areas that are more affordable, and other people coming in from places like Arlington and Fairfax. But I think it has been a tremendous factor on the region, and I think it's one that you're going to just see continue, at least over the next 5 or 10 years, to be a big factor in the housing market.
Great, thank you. Kurt, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. Hamilton, thanks for the information. Also, a question about comparison of the distribution of housing types in college towns and the desire chart that you kind of mentioned with the ages and the single family homes compared to our cohort college towns. Is there a sweet spot of distribution of housing types that balances quality of life, opportunity, and affordability in a way that one can measure? Is that a study that can be put together on a three-legged stool?
Yeah, there was a former colleague of mine who actually was at TJPDC for a while, Luke Jude, maybe some of you may remember him, and he used to have this expression that everyone wants to live on a 1 acre lot or a 5 acre lot, with a coffee shop around the corner. That if you ask people what they want, people do tend to want lower density, but they don't want everybody else to be lower density. They still want to be near everything, right? And so that's the sort of the tricky balance. And the study that Brad Wilcox had is asking people, what would you like, but not really sort of what, when you go through that, people still say they don't want these long commutes either. I think the point I made with Iowa City is when you look at them, they're building every type of housing, but they're building a lot of it. And they're doing it in a compact manner. I think it is going to vary, from place to place, geography to geography, what the appropriate density level is. I don't know if there's a one size. I think that when you look at Charlottesville, and I mentioned the Smart Growth America rankings, we are clearly building more dense than many other college towns. But what's unusual is we're doing that at a fairly high price. There are other places like Tuscaloosa, Alabama, that have a higher ranking in limiting sprawl and are growing at a faster rate, but also keeping housing more affordable. And Iowa City is one I was familiar with from staying there. And there's just some advantages they've had that I think our region hasn't had. I mentioned some of them. And that, that chart is just simply showing you, where Americans live. If you built apartments that were 3 bedrooms close to everything and they had lower level gardens for families, maybe it would be very different, right? But I think my training was partially as a planner, and I remember there was so much focus on density, and I think it's wonderful. But I think that is sort of a fact of life point people often miss, is that once people start families, they generally don't want to be apartments. And once they move into home, they generally don't want to go back to apartments. And that really has to be planned for.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilor Payne?
Yeah, thank you. Kind of a maybe incoherent question, but did you have data on just like a theoretical example? Let's say there's a developer who was going to build a project and was willing to sell it at cost. Obviously that wouldn't happen, but if they did, kind of what the price point of that new construction would be for a single family home once you factor in land costs, construction costs, interest rates, not even taking into account the financing and investor side. Was there any data on that? Because the narrative just made me think the biggest gap is for affordable home ownership. And it made me think, and we're also one of the only states that has this weird city-county divide, which makes Charlottesville landlocked. There's not a whole lot of infill development opportunities. To what extent is that product something the market at this point is incapable of producing, and we have to step in with basically social housing investment in order to provide it?
Yeah, it's one thing I didn't go into maybe as much, but I mentioned that $650,000 figure. That was from looking at Zillow the other day. It may have gone up or down. That's the cheapest new detached home. Somebody starting a family and they say they want a detached home, and they don't want to deal with an older home, so they need it new. And that's out in Crozet. If you go to Harrisonburg, you go to Stanton, look at Lynchburg, Richmond, even Northern Virginia, you find it far lower. Most of those areas, Northern Virginia is not down 300s. The other 3, you can find something down in the 300s. There's a sort of an issue where a lot of this goes back to land costs, but if it's expensive to live here, then you need to get paid more to live here, and that starts pushing up the construction costs, right? And so that kind of can kind of trickle along. Iowa City and a lot of other places do have this advantage where cities still can't annex. And so you sort of have this planning being a little bit more coordinated. There's close to a dozen towns or cities in Johnson County where Iowa City is located, and they're annexing. And so that is a difference. I think that a big issue now versus say a decade or two ago is that when you go back and look at that chart, that 3/5 of young households can't afford to buy the median value, which is pretty low, and that's assessed. Social housing, if they want to buy, is going to be very difficult to fill that when you're talking about most of that population. Possible. I mean, there are places, Luke Jude, my former colleagues in Vienna now, I think they do that there, but that is a massive undertaking. I think 10 years ago, that was sort of, you could fill, there was a certain segment of the population that couldn't get on the housing ladder, you could fit it. Now you're talking about most of the population coming in. I think it's a lot more difficult. But, I made that point at the end. I do think it would be helpful if you're thinking about the scale of the problem is look at Stanton, look at Harrisburg, look at Danville. Why is it so much cheaper there? They're all buying the same materials, right?
Right. But I think the land values are way lower and the demand
Right.
to live in those locations is lower. And certainly Harrisonburg is just looking at Charlottesville, the square mileage is significantly larger. But I do take your point and don't disagree with it. Just trying to think it through.
No, and your demand point is an excellent one and that's sort of where it gets tricky is, so what if you do build all that? Do you want to grow like Raleigh? Do you want to grow like Austin? Because that's potentially what happens. If you get housing in Charlottesville down to $300,000, you would be growing at a rate that I don't think politically anybody would want to deal with. So that's a tricky balance, right?
And I'll just end by saying the city had an economic analysis done as part of our new zoning. And one of the interesting findings, which was they estimated the only thing economically feasible 5 stories and above was student housing, because it was the only type of housing that provides a rent per square footage that investors found feasible. So I don't know what to make of that. We've certainly seen that our new infill development has only been student housing so far,
right.
Significantly larger. It was interesting your point that you've seen that a lot of students already are kind of out from the single family homes. So the benefit from filtering for this new student housing may be more limited than it was in the past. But I'll end there.
And I think there's still a benefit to a certain extent, but I think it's going to be more limited than the past. Harrisonburg, we've done some analysis with them, and they've had an interesting process where they continue to build a lot of student apartments, but their enrollment at JMU is not really growing. And they are still seeing more refugees stay. They're losing more families they did in the past, but it has had a benefit. But it's kind of, squeezing a lemon. There's only so much juice you get out of that, and you keep building apartments. Maybe it benefits young professionals, but there's going to be a large segment of the population. It's just not going to benefit as much anymore.
All right, I've got 2 more hands. So I'm going to call these the last 2 questions, just in the interest of time. But John, I see you're up next, and we'll go to Supervisor McHugh.
Yes, Hamilton, great presentation. A question kind of pertaining to Greene County. I didn't see a lot in your presentation, but majority of folks working in Greene are commuting to Albemarle, Charlottesville. So we've seen significant growth in housing development. I just wondering, do you see that continuing in the next 10, 20 years? I mean, we have a lot riding on that as far as funding infrastructure improvements based on the growth we've seen in the past 5 years.
Oh, thank you. I think 10 years ago, I would have said if Charlottesville and Albemarle, mostly I guess Albemarle, managed to increase its housing production, maybe it would lessen the growth in Greene and lessen that pressure. And I think if you did see that for some reason, maybe that would be the case. The big factor I mentioned that really has changed last few years is that we're really pulled into Northern Virginia's orbit. And there are a lot of people who really, being near Charleston might be nice, but Greene County is still somewhat near Northern Virginia. Madison County, I believe now is part of the Washington, D.C. metro area. So there's a lot more sort of that demand coming from that direction in the past. And I think that is going to sustain growth in Greene County in a way we just didn't have that operating maybe in the way before. So I would suspect so. I think you'll see sustained growth really from those 2 sources.
Thank you.
Diantha?
Yes, Diantha here, Hamilton. Thank you very much. Great presentation. And you managed to make it a different enough that it was fascinating for those of us that saw the first one as well. Quick question. You talked about, I'm specifically talking about Iowa City, and you mentioned their grid pattern, very intentional growth, but you said no growth boundaries. The boundaries are clear, but they move frequently. Now, this may be an Albemarle County specific question, but can you elaborate a little bit on that for me?
Yeah, and I spent a year there, and I was very interested, and I spoke with planners there a couple times, but I'm not by no means an expert. One of the things is they generally, there's annexation kind of coincides with growth, so it's sort of it's not as if they draw a boundary and they say, like in Albemarle County, here's the 5% where the growth has to be. If you come along and you say, I want to do growth out on this farmland here, and this is the model, and maybe the infrastructure's here, or I'll help get it there, the county's happy to go along with that, and they do that, and the city will annex it, and that's the process. And that's the way it works with the towns. One thing that really prevents, I think, is land banking, where if you know that's where all the growth can be in 5%, developers can come along and buy that up, and that pushes the prices up, and they can slowly release that. In this case, you don't know that. If a developer comes along with a great proposal in one section, that will get approved and developed. And so you don't necessarily see the land prices being inflated in the same way you see here in the county.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does that answer it somewhat?
Yeah, it does. And talk a little bit about, and I'm sorry, and I know what a grid pattern is, but obviously they've had a grid pattern for a long time. I mean, just.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. If you look at the map of Iowa City, they do and they don't, right? So the land was cut up in grids, but actually most of the major roads were run the same way in Charlottesville. They don't really make any sense. They're old cow paths. One of them is the paths the Mormons used to go out to Utah. So when they're doing that grid pattern, they're building that. It's not like those roads or right-of-ways are all there. When I was there, I saw them knocking down a dozen homes to try to extend that grid pattern. That's something you don't see happen a lot in our region, but they really valued having the connectivity. And so you see that quite a bit. They're knocking down homes pretty regularly. They're knocking down homes to put bike lanes, and it's something I can't imagine seeing in Charlottesville. But there really is this focus on you need to have a grid, you need to stick to the grid. It's just a different political culture than here, and I think everybody understands you need to do it, or at least enough people do that people keep being reelected.
Wow, that's interesting. So they just managed to not have any NIMBYs.
They somehow, I think that, once you see the benefits of the grid, you can keep selling, and people say, well, of course you need to keep maintaining it.
Yeah, interesting. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. And Christine, did you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, quick question. I was wondering if you can say just a brief bit about Louisa County, since they are in our planning district commission, but they're no longer in our MSA. I believe they're a micropolitan statistical area, like they're their own. They're not a part of an urban MSA, and the rapid growth that they're experiencing, and just, what's unique about Louisa that makes them a little bit different than the surrounding jurisdictions that at one point were very much like them?
I think that, I mentioned before, in some ways, it does have some similarities when you look at Fluvan, you look at Green, but what is maybe more, there's two things that really stand out with Louisa. One is just its location, where it's really right in that triangle between Charlottesville, DC, and Richmond. So it's not the Charlottesville metro area because it has so many people also going to North Virginia, so many going to Richmond. And it's attractive and it's close to these areas. It's able to pull in a large amount of growth. I think one thing that's also been important is that they've been able to sustain that. You've had some communities in Virginia, I won't name them, but there's other ones in the edge of the North Virginia metro area which have just said, we're not doing growth anymore, we're done with it. Louisa, for whatever reason, maybe because the lots were already there, maybe because they've politically allowed it, they've managed to keep permitting new construction. Having the lake there as well, though, I think has been a huge draw as well. On top of that, I mean, you put all that together, the location, the lake, being near Charlottesville, being near Richmond and North Virginia is really one of the reasons why it's been one of the fastest growing counties in Virginia, the last couple of years. And it's been really remarkable that it's managed to stay as affordable as it is, given its location and those amenities.
Hamilton, I want to thank you very much for your time today and for the presentation, and appreciate you leaving time for questions as well. I know that if others didn't get a question in, or you have a follow-up, I'm sure Hamilton, as he mentioned earlier, would be open for an email. And just encourage, as other times Hamilton comes out in the community to present, that folks do what they can to get out there, because I always learn quite a bit when I watch these presentations. So again, thank you, sir, for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay, committee, we need to move on, and we're just gonna need to be mindful of time. There is a Metropolitan Planning Organization meeting starting at 4, and I think they need the bandwidth for the electronic stuff by then, so we'll have to just wrap up, hard stop at that point. If I've got that wrong, somebody can come in and correct me. The next item on the agenda, we have the Speaker Series Advisory Committee and sponsorship. So we're going to have, I'm going to have Caden speak to this briefly. This came out of some things that we did in the past, but also our successful housing summit this past March. So Caden, you want to speak to this item?
Yeah, so the idea behind this is pretty much to have a dedicated group of individuals who are going to be responsible for putting together some of the events like this. So obviously we want these to continue. We want to have more guests, and speaking to the next speaker that we may possibly have is Chris McNamara from Virginia Housing, who's going to give a presentation. Hopefully that's a full commitment, as right now he wants to, but I'm gonna see if I can share my screen in terms of something we want to get done.
And while he's sharing his screen, we'll be doing some presentations like this during the quarterly meetings, but the idea is that we'll start doing some speaker series, some meetings that are outside of the official meeting times. And we need folks to volunteer to help just organize who the speakers may be. These would all be virtual, we believe, or at least in the planning. And then Caden will get into some of the sponsorship. We're hoping to get sponsors to cover the cost of these so we don't have to bear the brunt of that through an already pretty tight budget that we have here for the RHP. Thank you, Caden.
Yeah, so the potential behind these events is to eventually, like Ned was saying, is to bring in sponsorships and more revenue. So the lowest tier we have is the $50 donation, and we're going to have a dedicated spot on our website to where we have a location that describes, hey, these are all of our past or current sponsors who have been contributing towards our speaker series. And then next we have our $100 donation. And then as the money and the tiers go up, they will be featured on different levels. So one thing that we started incorporating more is our level of engagement on our social platforms. And so that's something that as these speaker series continue to go to happen, that we also are keeping up with our postings and our engagement to some of our people who are donating and are interested in sponsoring these events. So this is just long-term goals, and as momentum does build up around this idea and we do start expanding this these events outside of just our partnership, that there is potential to start bringing in revenue similar to how the Regional Housing Summit did for us.
So if those, so the executive committee, we've already had this discussion there. We have done some speaker series type things in the past. Keith, I don't know if you want to mention any items about how it's worked in the past, success-wise.
Yeah, thank you, Ned. Yeah, it's been super successful. It's kind of the reason why we wanted to resurrect it. I can't remember the exact numbers, but in most cases, we were in around 100 plus or minus attendees. So it was super successful. I think as Caden said, what we're trying to do is continue the success of the summit and keep these sessions going. You know, in essence, we just did one with Hamilton, right? That was probably, I mean, I was dancing in my seat because it was echoing everything I've been saying for a long time, to have somebody who's got a lot smarter than me that can say it. So that's the premise of it. But we want to keep it going, and it's a good income opportunity too. We can make a little bit of money for the RHP, which is always good.
And we don't see it as a heavy work lift for folks. It would be the type of idea, you know, obviously identifying topics of conversation, some of which have been informed by the survey that were coming out of the summit. And then obviously identifying relevant speakers to match the topics, and then helping to organize, getting people, you know, committed to the dates and times. The sponsorship then would be another piece of it. But again, you could see the numbers. We're not asking for thousands of dollars here, just some nominal sponsorships to help cover the cost of this. So This is a call for folks to get involved, to help us and get this committee up and running. So I'm going to ask first that those who would be interested in joining to email. I'm going to Logan. I think it's fine to have him email you. Yeah. Yep, I see his head nodding there. And then obviously, as these things can go, if we don't have an outpouring of folks signing up to get involved and get connected, we may have to do some voluntelling, which could be more of a random nature. So I'm just going to ask first for the next, through the summer, if folks could think about getting this set up. We'd like to get rolling in the fall after our September speakers already lined up for the quarterly meeting. It would be nice to have a couple more by the end of the year that this committee could be up and running by then. So again, just calling for that help. Any questions about anything or comments about anything? Great. And then the next item, activation of advisory committee. And this is something that has come up due to some memberships and some feedback that we've received when we reached out for comments about how things are going, but it's already on the books in our bylaws that we have this advisory committee. I'll let Logan get into the details of what we're talking about with this particular one.
Sure. So as Ned said, yeah, this is a provision that already exists in our bylaws, although it's admittedly vague. So you'll notice that's not on our bylaw approval for later in the agenda. But essentially what it stipulates is a list of stakeholders who are sort of kept in reserve and called upon as needed to provide sort of information about relevant housing topics. So we've kept a list of organizations to this point who are not necessarily represented by a member on the RHP, but are relevant to the work. And so our goal with this advisory committee to sort of activate it is to basically put people to the organizations. And so essentially we are looking for existing members or folks who are not currently on the partnership to join the advisory committee. It would be a separate body entirely and would not require the same demands in terms of your attendance and participation in these events. So for folks who would like to stay connected to the RHP and contribute, and I'll have Caden talk a little bit later about our SharePoint, which would be another sort of point of engagement that the RHP will look to for the advisory committee. But so there won't be demands in terms of attending our meetings, but it would require some engagement in terms of, as I mentioned, the SharePoint. Also being just willing to come and speak to this group. We've had group members in the past come and present similar to how Hamilton is presented today. And I think that body, sort of a pool of folks that we can look to say, hey, what's going on in your world? Can we get you to come, step into the RHP for a moment and share how your work is relevant to this group, even if you aren't a full member. So it's sort of a way to keep folks engaged without necessarily burdening people who may not have the bandwidth to be a full member. So we've already had a couple folks express interest in this. If there's anyone in this group that particularly folks who are not already on the partnership, but if there are people who are currently members of the partnership that this sort of appeals to, similarly reach out to me, and we'll begin to sort of do our own internal outreach to folks on this front. But yeah, that's all I'll say about it for the sake of time. But I think it's a good initiative for us to sort of make a more nuanced set of members. So.
Thank you, Logan. So, and part of this came out of the strategic plan. We had both the executive committee and at one of the quarterly meetings talking about the competition between wanting to grow and allow for more participation by folks, but then also the concern about having too big of a committee or group to have a functional executive committee or a functional partnership meeting. And we didn't want to have 40 voting members, that sort of piece. So this is kind of the compromise, if you would, to allow people to be participants, but then we don't have to vote them in as members of the partnership. They can help inform in terms of content, et cetera, with the SharePoint that we're going to talk about, speaker series, future quarterly meetings, and the annual meeting or the summit that we do every 2 years. So if there's anybody currently on the committee that would like to learn more about maybe moving into this role, you could certainly reach out to any one of us to discuss it. But if you have folks that maybe would like to participate, but are a little hesitant and wanting to get involved in a formal way, this is a great way for them to start participating with us and being on our periphery to help inform what we're doing. Can I entertain any questions or any concerns about that from the membership? All right, then we will move to, and we'll be sending out some follow-up email call to actions for some of these as reminders. The next, we got 2 action items we need to handle. Item A under number 5 is attendance and alternate bylaw approval. We've had, over the past year, we were starting to have some attendance, and what alternate means are the folks that are officially appointed to the board. We ask that all appointing bodies name an alternate to the appointed person as well. And this is really critical for our quorum so that when we do have to take votes that we have a quorum in place. So like for today, if we didn't have the quorum needed, then we couldn't take any of the votes. So we're going to start, I'd hate to say the word police it, but we just have to start being mindful of who's attending, not attending, and then handle it in a way that we're all clear on to have a functioning organization. Logan or Caden, do we need to add anything there that I haven't spoke to? This is just, or if somebody could review what the new policy will be.
Sure. Yeah, I could share my screen. So if we're just I'm entirely sure if you all can see that, but so yeah, as you mentioned, Ned, there's obviously already a bit in the alternate language here about designating an alternate. We're recommending that there be 2 alternates. So that's the only change that we see reflected here. And yeah, it would just be a matter of doing a roll call vote on that front. I can also run through the attendance one, I guess, as well. Where, yeah, to Ned's point, maybe about sort of policing. I wouldn't really call it that, but adding a stipulation about attendance for meetings. So you can see here, it's 3 consecutive absences are allowed, and you must attend at least 1 session per calendar year. And so, yeah, and also a reminder that you have to sort of formally designate your alternate. And so if we don't have that information prior, your alternate sort of won't count, I guess, for your attendance.
And obviously the members of the executive committee recognize that this is a fairly lenient attendance policy, seeing how the whole partnership meets 4 times a year. So it just goes to show that sometimes when they meet further apart, I think sometimes folks think, oh, maybe he doesn't track, I've missed 3 meetings, as if you're meeting on a more regularly basis. So this is just going to be a friendly policy to just make sure folks are committed, or we have the right people in the seats that are interested in attending. Any questions or concerns about this particular item or the update to the bylaws?
Just a process question. So are we doing 2 separate actions, or we're combining them into one action on this?
I think we can do one action to amend
Both.
to the motion would be to adopt the changes to the bylaws. I think would cover it.
Well, then I'm going to make that motion, sir.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
We've got a motion and a second. I'm going to ask that all voting members go ahead and unmute your mics. We'll have to do a roll call for this one. Logan, you'll do the call?
Yes, Ned Galloway,
Yes.
Michael Payne,
Yes.
John McCloskey,
Yes.
Jesse Rutherford,
Yes.
Diantha McKeel,
Yes.
Keith Smith,
Yes.
Luke Rourke, you can circle back, Emily Dreyfus,
Yes.
Kurt Kiesecker,
Yes.
William Park,
Yes.
Peter Holman,
Yes.
Michelle Wamsley, Shayla Washington, Dave Norris,
Yes.
Kathleen Glenn Matthews,
Yes.
Bree Murray Key, Rachel Jones, Margaret Claire, Fitzgerald Barnes, Luke Rourke. I see Luke is here, but okay. Cameron Moore, Michelle Wamsley, she may be gone as well. I can't quite see the full screen.
That's fine. They are on, but they are muted and off camera. Did we get for Alice, Rachel, you're able to vote as the alternate?
Yes.
I think that is all we have. I just want to remind folks, because we do have some folks on that are not responding. The new electronic guidelines that were put out last July 1 in 2024, if you are on an electronic meeting and your camera is off and you're muted, you're considered out of the meeting. That hasn't, I've noted it. I haven't seen us drop below quorum, so I haven't said anything. But I just need to remind folks that as part of public bodies like this, that in order to be in the meeting, it's like stepping out of the room if you turn your camera away and your quorum is lost. So I need everyone, when you're on the electronic meetings in the future, to make sure you stay, you can mute by sure, but you need to keep your camera on or you're just not in the meeting. So appreciate everybody's adherence to those state code guidelines. Thank you. All right, the next item, old business, the SharePoint. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just quickly, indulge me for just 1 minute because we've had a little lapse. The Regional Transit Partnership designated Brian Pinkston to be my alternate months and months ago. So I'm just taking this opportunity to let everybody know somehow or another we need to get his name onto my as my designee or the alternate for the Regional Transit Partnership.
Got you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and I just want to take this opportunity. Thank you.
And I do appreciate everybody getting alternates named. We've been working on that since November, December. So a lot of folks have done that. So thank you so much for that. The next item is the SharePoint launch. This came out of the summit. It's a way that we mentioned at the summit, and since the executive committee's talked about having an area to, Keith, did you need something?
Yes, sir. I think you have a 5B as an action item.
Oh, I missed one there. Sorry.
Alice.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith, catching me. That's an official action. We have to, I mentioned Alice for Rachel to vote, and then we didn't even put Alice in the official place. Alice, we had Colette Sheehy, who was the representative from UVA on the executive committee and the partnership prior. Alice Rauscher is now taking her place. So we do need to officially appoint her to the executive committee, even though she was already a member of the partnership.
I will make that motion, sir.
Right, is there a second?
Second.
This one we can do by acclamation. If everyone could please unmute who are voting. And then all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Are there any opposed? Abstentions? Very good. The motion carries. Thank you, Keith, for catching that. All right, now we'll move to the SharePoint launch. This is a way, the SharePoint is basically the spot where anybody in the partnership, perhaps the new formed advisory committee, can just download resources for everybody to share. And we'll have a process in which we'll have to, they'll go through some of those steps. But this is a way for us to share resources with one another without having to necessarily go, oh, we're going to shoot emails to everybody. Everybody should have access to it. And then we'll be able to send information in, and it will be uploaded and updated in a timely manner. Caden, you want to review this item?
Yeah, I can go through it. I'm gonna share my screen as well. Everyone can see this? Yeah,
Yes,
I'm
you're
getting
good to
some
go.
nods. Okay. Yeah, so the like Ned was saying, the SharePoint is going to be very crucial for us on the RHP. Pretty much essentially is, your centralized location for all housing resources, in particular, to instead of us having to shoot emails or having discussions in meetings, we can all have a location to where we know there will be information found. And there's 3 ways we can upload information. So say similar to this, I attended a meeting and I said, hey, Hamilton, send me over your presentation slides. I want to put it into the Central Housing Hub, the SharePoint. So I'll just go through this folder, I'll open it, and then I'll hit upload, and I'll have the 2 options to where I can make a new folder, or I choose one of my files on my computer. And then let's say you recently attended an event, or that event's coming up that you would like the RHP to be aware of. So you can just go here. It's under where a little, if you notice, there's already some dates that are already placed there. But you essentially put the title of what event you're going to, the information and the time of it, where. I do believe that it is an online one. You can just place it in here. And then you can also do a description for people in case they don't know what this event may be about. And then lastly, the other way, you can send information. And this right here takes you to our homepage. This takes you to our blog page, and this takes you to the summit page, which is on our website. And then lastly, this is the latest news section. I think this is what people may be using most often, but there's 2 ways you can submit information that you want to share. So say there's an online news article. So you just want to hit add, hit news link, and it's as simple as copy and pasting the web address into it and then submitting it. Or you can do it the other way. And this is what the first one looks like. So I click the link. It immediately takes me to the document that I had, and people can read all about it and inform themselves about it. And then the other way was, if you do want to describe what the item was, you are given that option to go through, put the information in yourself, as well as also still include the link. And if you still click it, it can take you to the document that you were referring to. So this is a great way, like Logan and Ned said before, to get our advisory committee engaged, because although they don't have the necessary demands as attending our meetings or keeping up or attending some of the events, they still have a way to keep up with our some of the things that are happening, as well as submitting information that they know in their areas of expertise. And so yeah, this Central Housing Hub is going to be really big for the RHP moving forward in terms of how we share and communicate between each other. And the more effort and more attention we put into this, the more benefits it has for everyone.
Thank you, Caden. And I would encourage folks like the news link. Call out Diantha, but Diantha will often, if there are news articles that she reads that's pertinent to something on our board, she often shares it with the other board members, which I've always appreciated. But in this particular body, since we have 3 different groups, it could be real interesting for somebody from the private sector sharing a news link that's relevant, that electeds are going to see, or nonprofits share something that for-profits wouldn't necessarily see. So it's a good way to start cross-pollinating sometimes the world you live in, and sharing especially the news links. The other data, of course, I'm not trying to undermine it, but I think sometimes that information is what is lost. And go, oh, well, I'll email that out. Maybe it happens or doesn't happen. So Hope folks will get engaged with that. We'll send out some email reminders, just encouraging some folks to participate and upload things, but share away and we'll see how it goes and revisit what it's looking like in September. All right, we're just going to move to 2 quick staff updates under number 7. General housing program updates. Ruth, is Ruth on? Is Ruth handling that? She's listed. Oh, there you are. Didn't see Ruth's name.
Hey, all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, so I just want to give some general updates. To date, we have not seen an HPG Housing Preservation Grant notice of funding opportunity posted for this next fiscal year, so we are still waiting to see if that is posted. In addition, we are happy to report that, as you know, the Regional Housing Summit back in March was able to fully fund itself, and therefore we were not needing to move funds from the RHP budget over to the summit budget to help cover those expenses. So we were able to use some of those funds for additional staff time for the RHP to work on some of the initiatives that you've heard about today. I don't have any other updates at this time for you all.
Great. Any questions there? All right, then we'll move to the Housing Summit survey update. I think this was shared with everybody after the summit, but we just wanted to touch on some highlights of that. Logan, you're going to handle that one.
Yep, I'll just share my screen real quick. Yeah, as Ned said, this was all shared out with folks, but just sort of a broad strokes overview. Most of our summit attendees were, or the plurality, I should say, of our summit attendees were business related. This graph represents the folks who responded to the survey. So most folks who responded to the survey were either government or nonprofit, as opposed to there was a large contingent of business folks there, but didn't quite fill out the survey in a representative way. By and large, the majority of feedback was very good, good or excellent across these parameters, which I think is telling of the work this group put in to pull off that event. Yeah, there were a number of sort of actions that folks wanted to take in sort of coming out of conversations with other summit folks. You can see them here. I won't belabor the point. I'll touch on maybe a little bit later at the end some of the topics I think for future discussion with this group and with future speaker series and summits. This was an interesting graph here. So this group I think has long talked about sort of the urban and rural, I think, divide. And so this graph illustrates a little bit that there's potentially a discrepancy in how this was viewed, although still almost 60% of respondents spoke to how rural housing was addressed at the event. I think there were only 61 attendees who were sort of living in a rural area at the time. So and it was most folks considered it was relevant to urban needs. This was also a little bit interesting to see, I think, which sessions folks found useful. maybe I was biased because I sort of was the moderator, or not the moderator, but I helped work on it. It's the listening to each other dialogue one. Wasn't quite as high on this list, but that one also wasn't quite as well attended as potentially some of these other ones. Anyway, you feel free to scroll through that list as you see fit. Down here, I think there was basically the consensus that folks made connections and took away new knowledge that will sort of positively impact our ability to provide affordable housing, which I think is good. However, I think, down here we saw also a lot of people who have ideas of what more they would want to know. And I think one of the large themes from down here is just more sort of funding opportunities, or opportunities to talk about which funding opportunities are available. And I think hopefully through like our SharePoint and through maybe the advisory committee now being activated in a new way, this will be an opportunity for our group to share more information in these particular departments. And we can then maybe use some of that to inform these future it's called Lunch and Learns here, but we have preferred speaker series moving forward. And so anyway, that's the summary. If I've missed anything, Lori Jean, you feel free to chime in. But if anyone has any questions.
And that last page, if you call that back, you don't need to call it back up, but that where the list of suggestions and topics, I would just point out that that's a good area to start with the SharePoint file for anybody that has information related to that last list. That would be, that's a great start, because that's what folks were looking for coming out of the summit for solutions in action. All right, folks, we're going to go through our roundtable. If you're first time attendee today, the roundtable is where we go through with each member and share some things relative to housing that's happening in your world. Doesn't have to be real long. We got a lot of people to get through, so I just ask that you be neat and tidy with your updates today. I'm just going to go down through my list. Councilor Payne, you're first on my list here.
Sure. Keep it short. Big thing for housing for us is we're beginning a study of a tax incentive to help our inclusionary zoning affordable housing program. And the big thing we're interested to see is if we all agree a lack of new supply is an issue and we need new supply. For us in Charlottesville, to what extent is that lack of supply caused by zoning versus lack of financing and other broader economic issues?
Awesome. Thank you so much. Mr. Snook, anything to add? Not need necessary, but I see you're here, so I'll afford the opportunity.
Well, the only thing that I would add is something that is beginning to work through for us is our neighborhood development services folks are looking at a list of things that we didn't quite get to when we passed the zoning ordinance now almost 2 years ago. Things like, for example, what do we need to do differently about Airbnbs and short-term rentals like that? There are a few other topics like that that we just decided in December of 2023 we just didn't have time to get to, but we wanted to pass the ordinance. Now we've got to go back and clean some of those things up. So that'll be working its way through the Planning Commission and then eventually the council probably 6 months from now.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Stook. Mr. McCluskey, I got you next up in Greene County.
Yes, you have to excuse me. I'm driving while my wife is driving across Nebraska right now. Yeah, so I can confirm Greene County, I guess, there is no appetite or action towards addressing affordable housing at this time. There still is the need, but unlike other counties and PDC, there's no action from the board to address, any activities that would increase the availability of affordable housing. So, and we are, I guess, next week having a meeting, getting more education around the update from Laura Jean Tellum next Monday for the regional housing study. So looking forward to that. And I do have David Masterovich is my alternate, which he has joined the meeting with us today.
Very good. Mr. Mastrovich, any updates that you'd like to provide?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks. I think what was important was last night the board met and has said to go forward with our water project, and that will dictate housing in Greene County for the next 30 years. So it sounds like we may be able to start having affordable housing now that we have water to supply them with. It was a
Yep.
big deal.
Well, sure. I know the issues Green have been dealing with out there. And as that SharePoint is designed, the RHP is here to support different jurisdictions, not to try to tell them or dictate to them. You know, you're in control of your own policy. But if there's information in there that all want to share, as we hear different flavors from the different jurisdictions, then that SharePoint could be a good spot for folks to glean some info from. Well, thank you both for attending today, and good to hear from you what's happening in Greene. Jesse down in Nelson.
What are you doing? Thank you. Good meeting, guys. Thank you, staff. You know, we have a zoning meeting at 5, so we'll basically figure out all of our region's problems just in Nelson County in a few hours, I imagine. Right, Ernie? Yes, he said yes. Other than that, you know, we the appetite's there. The zoning's got to get changed. We got a long road to go, and then work on the zoning map and see what we do. So beyond that, that's all I got. Thank you.
I did see Ernie here. Is he still on? Anything to add, Ernie? I'm not seeing his name at this point.
Oh, he's headed to our meeting at 5.
He's
or
moving to the
4:30.
meeting.
Yep.
Got it.
I'm leaving in 10 minutes.
Supervisor McKeel, I've got you up next.
There we go. Thank you. From the transit world, you all probably remember that we have now Charlottesville and Albemarle have established the Charlottesville Albemarle Regional Transit Authority. So what's happening right now is every other month, we're meeting, taking turns with the partnership and the authority while we're trying to get the authority up and running. I may have said that in a confusing way, but I think you all get it. The fourth Thursday of every month, we are alternating. We have adopted bylaws for the authority, but we're still working on who's going to be a part of the authority and in reaching out to surrounding counties to see if they would like to join us. So more to come. Our next authority meeting is July 24th, and we meet at TJPDC. At 5 o'clock. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And then I think Luke had to exit. I don't see Luke Rourke still on the call. And Keith had to leave for a business item as well. So that brings us to Emily Dreyfus.
All right, so I've been doing some work with a couple of buildings lately, and one of them is Midway Manor, which received a major redevelopment over the past probably 12 to 18 months, and people are experiencing air conditioning problems, and they have ongoing elevator problems, so that's been a little rough, especially given this weather. And I've also been doing some work with FAR, the Public Housing Association of Residents. They're very active with redevelopment and also community safety. There was a lot of concern around how the police came into one of the neighborhoods recently when they were searching for someone because there was actually a tank used, and that's something that we're discussing and figuring out and hoping that that was a very unique situation. Most of my work with FAR is on fundraising, so less exciting. That's it for me.
Thank you. Kurt Kiesecker.
Thanks, everybody. I wanted to introduce Taro Matsuno from our office. He's my alternate. He's on my screen in the bottom left-hand corner, and he's an architect, and we work together on housing projects here in the office. And so my report will be probably more granular than some of the big picture things that have been noted so far, but our office is working on a project at Southwood with PHA will probably be certificate of occupancy in the next month to 6 weeks at Hickory Hope for 121 affordable housing units. And we broke ground recently on South First Street, a project we've talked about with Emily and FAR and all those good folks for 5 or 6 years. So it's very exciting to have ground broken for phase 2 at South First Street, and footings going in the ground as we speak for 113 units there. Taro's working on a Vista 29 project with Support Works Housing at the Premier Circle site that is under construction. I think also footings and foundation walls kind of coming out of the ground for 80 units of housing there. And PHA told us that another project that they have here in the city on Park Street made it into the funding round, hopefully, at Virginia Housing for some tax credits for future momentum on other projects coming down the line. So the wheels turn slowly, but still turning. So I think that's all I can report today.
Great. Thank you for the update.
Yes,
and
sir.
Hello to Taro. Taro, any additional quick items to add?
Yeah, I think we've been, it's nice to meet everybody. We're also seeing a little bit more interest in folks trying to develop infill housing in various points of the city and the county. So we're interested to be diving into ways that we could try to make that possible. And we'll be keeping an eye on definitely construction costs in the next couple months, years to understand their feasibility. But you know, it's nice to be branching out into different forms and different types and seeing how they can be a part of the fabric of our cities.
That's great. We'll be interested in hearing what you have to share relative to some of that in terms of especially costs. Mr. Park, we got you up next.
Thank you, Dad. Enjoyed the presentation today. We're in the process of, I don't know, various stages leasing up about 600 units around the state, Fluvanna, Winchester, and actually even in Charlestown, West Virginia. Just broke ground on 80 townhouse units in Blacksburg, for sale units, and probably have about another 500 rental units around the state that we have in development that if you've got any sway on the 10-year treasury to reduce that a little bit, it would be very helpful so we could get started.
Very good. Thank you, sir. Mr. Holman, I've got you up next.
Thank you. I appreciate the comment on the 10-year treasury. If we can have some influence, I'd appreciate that as well. Likewise, I appreciated the presentation. Hamilton touched on the periphery with regard to the effect of interest rates on affordability. Obviously, that's something that we pay attention to very closely. For our outlook for the rest of 2025 and through 2027, that's a good news, bad news type situation. Good news is our expectation is we won't see that rate move up dramatically higher, but bad news is we're not expecting any relief in mortgage rates as well. We expect to kind of trade in the range that we're seeing right now. So obviously that is a very large external force that impacts housing affordability. We're expecting it to sort of remain static for where it is right now. Of course, the world is a big place. A lot of factors can influence it and change it. As we see, we live in a very, very volatile world. I'll just note that a lot of the data points that Hamilton was sharing, we're seeing corollary to that, you know, in our own member behavior, mortgage production, and we've seen a lot of success in programs such as our Hometown Heroes mortgage product, which provides favorable financing terms and options for first responders, EMTs, doctors, police, so that gives them additional options that they can afford housing closer to our community that they support.
Thank you, sir. And we had a few folks that had to jump off to go to their own four, but I have Rachel up next for UVA.
Sure, I'll share a few things about the university's affordable housing initiative. For the Wirtland and 10th Street and Piedmont sites, we're still very much focused on pre-construction activities. So that includes things like financing, site due diligence, early design concepts, rezoning. And for both of those sites, both of our development partners are considering alternative financing plans in light of uncertainty in the industry, tariffs, changes in federal funding. I think the landscape is changing quickly, so we're all trying to get our arms around that. But we're all continuing to work diligently on these projects and assessing the path forward. And then at North Fork, the request for proposals was issued on April 30th, and the foundation anticipates selecting a partner for that site this summer and continuing pre-construction activities in 2025. And then I'll also share that for the second year housing project, we broke ground at Emmett Ivy.
Thank you so much for those updates. Just covered my list of who's next. Rachel, Annette, I know Kim was not here. Is Kim's alternate? There you go, Andrea. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Hi, thanks, Ned. I'm Andrea Madison, and the Fluvanna-Louisa Housing Foundation is excited. We're about to break ground here probably in the next 30 days or less, hopefully, on the 25 rental unit project here in Louisa County. The 17 unit project in Fluvanna County is still in the design phase, and that's still progressing forward. From our essential home repairs program, I know we are very anxious and chomping at the bit for HPG, the next round of HPG funds to be available again. I know we have a lot of projects that are kind of just waiting in the wings and teed up for when we hear about those funds being available. And I think we had a couple of projects that are looking forward to the SAP funds, that program becoming available as well. So I think those are the highlights of what's going on here.
Thank you so much, Andrea.
Thank you.
And then did I miss anybody? I think I've got everybody. I would say that, go, Kathleen, I'm sorry. There you go. I thought I saw a chat saying you had jumped off. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I do have to jump off in just a second, so I'll keep it really brief. And we have groundbreaking happening. As Kurt was saying, at South First Street, also at 6th Street, and planning happening for future sites at West Haven and expansion at 6th Street. We're excited to announce we just got a 2-year grant from DCJS for violence interruption, and we're in the process of hiring a youth coordinator for that program, which we're very excited about. Our self-sufficiency office at the Jefferson School is up and running, and we're also looking at expanding some resident service over to 6th Street. But good to see you all.
Great. Thank you for the update. I'd simply say for Albemarle, we're working through our comprehensive plan right now. So the work that we do in both the development area and the rural area and our affordable housing chapter will be what impacts housing the most as we make final decisions on that. And in May, the board started conversations about an affordable housing trust fund, the establishment of, and then how it could be funded. So we're on the on-ramp to making the decision finally about the creation of a trust fund. And then, as most probably know, well, maybe most don't know, we did have a tax increase this year, and 0.4 cents of that 4-cent tax increase was dedicated to go to our affordable housing fund. And the idea is that dedication will remain true in future years as well. This is the first time that Albemarle is dedicating ongoing operational dollars to housing trust fund versus money just coming from surplus. So that's a couple of the changes in Albemarle that we agree and think is a good thing. Well, I appreciate everyone being here, especially hopefully all your AC is working properly in the heat. The next meetings relative to the partnership, the executive committee will meet July 23rd and 25, but as a reminder, that'll be a virtual meeting. And then the full partnership will meet again in September 24th. And as somebody mentioned earlier, we do have one good speaker already lined up for that from Virginia Housing. So we're looking forward to that presentation. But in the meantime, I hope you all enjoy a wonderful summer. Thank you for all that you do and for all the sharing. And just to leave the final thought, get into SharePoint and keep putting some information out there that we can all share resources with and learn from. So thank you all. I hope you all have a good rest of your day. And I will say that our meeting is officially adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.